Chapter 1. The Merchant's Arrival. The sky over Momin, a city once kissed by the grace of kings, now lay under the spell of twilight, veiled in the deepening hues of dusk. The horizon, once ablaze with the fading light, now gave way to shadows that stretched and curled like serpents slithering through the cobbled streets. The city held its breath, waiting for something or someone. A lone figure, cloaked in the thick darkness of the evening, moved through the market. His steps were steady, but the air around him thrummed with an unspoken tension. Hasan Walid, a Turkish merchant whose name echoed in the distant corners of trade routes, was no ordinary traveler. He did not merely sell silks or spices. There was something dangerous, something hidden beneath his quiet demeanor. His eyes, sharp as the steel of his blade, scanned the streets of Banga like a man accustomed to surveying a battlefield. His garments, though simple, bore the wear of many journeys, and the roughness of his hands betrayed a past shaped by both commerce and combat. Whispers followed him as he moved, whispers of a man who could kill as easily as he could bargain, a man who had seen both wealth and ruin, and who carried with him secrets as heavy as his worn leather satchel. The people of Momin watched him from the shadows of their stalls, unsure of what to make of this stranger. The marketplace, usually alive with the sounds of bartering and laughter, had grown quiet. Eyes peered from behind the veils of merchants' wives, from behind hanging fabrics, wondering who this man was and what he sought. High above, within the confines of an estate that stood like a fortress against the city's restless pulse, Menka Bala leaned against the arched window of her room. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders like the night itself, her gaze distant as it swept over the city below. She was the daughter of immerse, one of the greatest scholars of the land, a man known for his wisdom, his unyielding mind, and his guarded heart. But Menka's heart was not her father's. Though she had grown up surrounded by the knowledge and teachings of the learned men who frequented her father's court, her spirit longed for something beyond books and scholarly debates. There was a restlessness in her soul that no philosophy could calm, a hunger for something she could not name. As the evening air whispered through her chamber, it carried with it a strange feeling, one that made her heart quicken. She did not know it yet, but her life was about to change, as surely as the wind changes course. Down in the city streets, a wiry boy with quick hands and quicker eyes moved between the stalls. Ishak, no more than 15 years old, had made the streets his home. Orphaned at a young age, he had learned to survive by his wits, weaving through the market like a fox in the night. He spotted Hasan from a distance and felt an immediate pull. This was no ordinary merchant. Ishak had seen men like Hasan before, men who carried stories in their eyes, men whose pasts clung to them like shadows. With a grin that spoke of both mischief and curiosity, Ishak slipped through the crowd and appeared at Hasan's side. "You're not from here," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Hasan turned, his gaze falling on the boy. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, as though he had seen many boys like Ishak in many other cities. "No," Hasan replied, his voice a deep rumble. "I am not." "Men like you don't just come to places like this," Ishak continued, undeterred. "Not unless they're looking for something." Hasan regarded the boy for a moment longer, as though weighing his words. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he said, "A man always seeks what is lost." Ishak grinned, sensing a challenge. "Well, if you're looking for something, I can help you find it. I know these streets better than anyone." Hasan's smile faded, replaced by the cold distance of a man who has lived too long in the company of danger. "And what would a boy like you want in return?" Ishak's grin widened. "Maybe just a few coins, or maybe a story. I like stories." Hasan's gaze shifted away from the boy, back toward the distant estate on the hill. "We'll see," he said softly, as though speaking to himself. As Hasan and Ishak moved deeper into the city, the shadows lengthened. Above them, in the estate, Guru Rugov, the wise and weathered advisor to Ammar Singh, stood at the gates, watching the city below with an air of quiet contemplation. His old bones ached with the weight of years, but his mind was sharp, always observing, always sensing the subtle shifts in the world around him. The arrival of this merchant had not gone unnoticed. There was something in the air tonight, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Change was coming, and it was wrapped in the cloak of the stranger from the west. Chapter 2: Shadows of the Past. The evening sky stretched out like an ancient tapestry, hues of orange and violet bleeding into one another, as if the heavens themselves were in conflict. Menka Bala stood on the terrace of her family's mansion, her long braid catching the dying sunlight, and her thoughts were far beyond the confines of her home. She gazed toward the horizon, where the Ganges met the distant woods. To her, those woods were a symbol of everything she had never known, a world filled with adventure, danger, and, perhaps most importantly, freedom. Her life in Banga had always been confined within the tall walls of her father's estate, the constant reminders of her heritage, and the heavy weight of expectations. She was the daughter of Ammar Singh, one of the 9 renowned scholars of Emperor Chandragupta Vikramaditya's court, and the granddaughter of warriors and poets alike. But that lineage, as illustrious as it was, felt like a gilded cage. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Menka, are you still lost in the sky?" It was her cousin Rupali, whose soft presence was a constant comfort in her otherwise restless world. Rupali was like Menka in many ways, beautiful, intelligent, but where Menka's heart craved adventure, Rupali's craved peace. Menka sighed and turned to face her cousin. "Do you never wonder what lies beyond, Rupali? Beyond the estate, beyond the forest? What stories could be unfolding without us knowing?" Rupali laughed lightly. "I'm content with the stories our elders tell us, Menka. The world outside is not as kind as the world inside these walls." "But it must be real," Menka whispered, almost to herself. "I want to know what it feels like to walk through those woods, to see places no one has told us about." Rupali was about to respond when they heard the sound of footsteps below. Ammar Singh's voice echoed through the corridors, welcoming a guest with the rare tone of familiarity Menka seldom heard him use. Menka peered over the balcony, curiosity sparking in her eyes. A tall, broad-shouldered man was standing in the courtyard, his posture confident but not arrogant, his attire simple yet foreign. The cut of his clothes and the richness of the deep, indigo fabric marked him as someone of importance, but it was his face that intrigued Menka. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the estate as though he were both stranger and native at once. His beard was neatly trimmed, his skin tanned by travel, and there was something both mysterious and powerful about him. He looked like a man who had seen more than most, a man who carried secrets. "Who is that?" Menka asked, her heart skipping a beat. Rupali followed her gaze. "That must be the Turkish merchant, Hasan Walid. Father mentioned him during dinner last night. He has traveled from far lands to visit your father." Menka frowned. "A merchant? Why would father entertain a foreign merchant in such a manner?" Rupali shrugged. "I believe it has something to do with your uncle. Hasan was once in his debt, or something along those lines." The mention of her uncle stirred something in Menka. Her father seldom spoke of him. He had been a wanderer, a scholar who had left the safety of their home to explore the wider world, much to Ammar Singh's displeasure. Her uncle had been a figure of fascination for Menka ever since she was a child, a man whose adventurous spirit seemed to live on in her. If this Hasan was connected to him, then perhaps there was more to his visit than mere trade. "Come," Rupali urged. "We shouldn't be seen spying." But Menka couldn't help herself. She lingered a moment longer, watching Hasan interact with her father. Though Ammar Singh held himself with his usual authority, there was a subtle deference in his manner, as though Hasan commanded respect without asking for it. The sight of it sent a shiver through Menka. Later that evening, the household gathered for dinner. The dining hall was grand, lit by flickering oil lamps that cast long shadows on the stone walls. The smell of freshly baked bread, spiced curries, and roasted meats filled the air, but Menka had no appetite. Her mind was fixated on the guest who now sat beside her father, quietly conversing in a language she didn't fully understand. Menka, Ammar Singh's voice broke through her thoughts, drawing her attention to the table. This is Hasan Walid, a man of great respect in his homeland. Menka looked up, meeting Hasan's eyes for the first time at such close proximity. His gaze was piercing, but there was a softness in his expression, as if he were aware of the questions bubbling up within her and was already prepared to answer them. He inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement of her, a gesture that was both formal and courteous. I have heard of your travels, Menka said, breaking the silence that had settled at the table. Her father shot her a warning glance, but she pressed on, unable to contain her curiosity. They say you've been to places few from here have ever seen. Hasan smiled, a small, knowing smile that barely reached his eyes. The world is vast, Lady Menka. I have seen many lands, but I suspect it is not my travels you wish to know about. Menka felt a warmth rise to her cheeks, but she refused to be intimidated. You knew my uncle, didn't you? At this, Ammar Singh shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Hasan's expression did not falter. I did. He was a man of great knowledge, a seeker of truths that others were too afraid to pursue. He helped me in ways I cannot fully repay. Menka leaned forward, captivated by every word. What was he like? My father rarely speaks of him. Hasan's eyes flicked briefly to Ammar Singh before returning to Menka. He was brave, much like you, I suspect. He sought freedom, not just from physical confines, but from the limitations others placed on him. In that, he was much like a bird who longs to fly, but is constantly tethered. Menka's heart stirred at his words. In that moment, it was as if Hasan had seen straight into her soul, understanding the desires she had kept hidden for so long. She had always felt like that bird, longing to soar but bound by the expectations of her family, her heritage. Her father cleared his throat, drawing the attention back to him. Your uncle's path was a dangerous one. He left behind responsibilities for the sake of adventure, and it led to his downfall. I would not see my daughter make the same mistake. Menka's eyes narrowed, a flicker of defiance crossing her face. I am not my uncle, father, but perhaps there is more to life than what we are told. Hasan said nothing, but Menka could sense his silent approval. He was a man who understood the conflict between duty and desire, and in that moment, she knew that her path, whatever it may be, would somehow be tied to him. Later that night, as Menka lay in her bed, her mind raced with thoughts of Hasan and her uncle. The connection between the two seemed to beckon her toward something more than the life she had always known. The stories her father had told her seemed incomplete, lacking the vibrancy and danger she craved. She could not help but wonder what her uncle had seen, what truths he had uncovered in the world beyond Banga. And more than that, she wondered what role Hasan had played in those adventures. She knew, deep down, that he had not come to their home merely to repay a debt. There was something more to his presence, something unspoken. Her heart thudded in her chest as she recalled the look in Hasan's eyes when he spoke of her uncle. He had seen something in her, a restlessness, a longing for freedom that mirrored his own. In that moment, she felt a bond with him, a shared understanding that neither of them had spoken aloud. The thought of leaving her sheltered life behind, of embarking on a journey with Hasan, thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. She knew her father would never allow it, but for the first time in her life, Menka felt as though her destiny was no longer in her father's hands. It was hers. The shadows of the past were closing in, and with them came the promise of a future Menka could no longer ignore. Chapter 3. A Silent Affection. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, violet shadows over the quiet estate. The air held a slight chill, hinting at the impending winter, But Menka Bala felt none of it as she sat near the great window of her chamber, her thoughts lingering on the enigmatic presence that had entered her life. Hasan Walid, the Turkish merchant with his calm, commanding aura, had stirred something deep within her, a longing she hadn't realized was there until he arrived. The evening had passed uneventfully, with guests and family mingling in the hall. But Menka's thoughts were not on the mundane conversations that swirled around her. Instead, her mind wandered back to the brief exchanges she had shared with Hasan. His words, though measured, had been filled with a quiet wisdom, and every time their eyes met, it was as if an unspoken understanding passed between them. The estate had fallen into silence now, the servants retiring to their quarters and the night's stillness settling in. Menka, however, could not find peace in sleep. She stood by the window, her eyes searching the garden below where the trees swayed softly in the night breeze. The stars above twinkled in a canopy of darkness, mirroring the thoughts twinkling restlessly in her mind. Suddenly, a flicker of movement in the garden caught her eye. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure, Hasan, walking alone beneath the trees. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, his silhouette strong and calm, but somehow troubled. Without thinking, Menka grabbed her shawl and slipped silently from her room, her heart pounding as she made her way through the quiet corridors of the mansion. She reached the garden moments later, the cool air brushing against her cheeks as she stepped into the night. Hasan had his back to her, his hands clasped behind him as he stared up at the sky, lost in the constellations above. Menka hesitated, unsure of what had drawn her to him, yet feeling an undeniable pull to be near him. Before she could speak, Hasan turned, as if sensing her presence. His expression softened when he saw her, though there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Lady Menka," he said quietly, bowing his head in acknowledgement. "You should be resting." Menka smiled, a touch of playfulness in her voice. "Should I? And yet here you are, wandering the gardens when most would be asleep." Hasan chuckled softly, a deep, warm sound that made her pulse quicken. "I find the night to be a time for reflection. The world is quieter, and thoughts are clearer when all else is still." Menka stepped closer, her curiosity piqued. "And what are these thoughts that trouble you, Hasan Walid?" For a moment, there was silence. Hasan's gaze shifted from the stars to the ground, and for the first time, Menka saw something in him that she had not seen before: vulnerability. "The past," he said, his voice low. "And the future." Menka tilted her head, intrigued by his words. "You speak like a man who has seen much of both." Hasan smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "I have traveled far, seen lands that would astound you, Lady Menka. But with those travels come burdens, memories that are not so easily forgotten." Menka's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to know more, to understand the man who stood before her. She felt as though there was an entire world hidden within him, a world filled with stories of adventure, danger, and loss, stories that she longed to hear. "Tell me of your travels," she said softly, stepping even closer until she was standing just a few feet from him. "Tell me what you have seen." Hasan looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. There was a flicker of hesitation, as though he were weighing the decision to share the truth of his experiences with her. But then, slowly, he nodded. "I have traveled across many lands," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "From the deserts of Persia to the grand cities of Constantinople. I have crossed treacherous seas and braved harsh winters in the mountains of the north. But it is not the places that stay with me, Lady Menka. It is the people." Menka's heart fluttered at the way his voice softened when he spoke of the people he had met. There was a deep compassion in his tone, an understanding of the human condition that transcended the physical landscapes of his travels. "I have met kings and beggars," Hasan continued, his gaze distant. "Warriors and poets. Some have fought for riches, others for love. And in the end, it is always the same. What people seek is not wealth or power. It is freedom." Menka's pulse quickened at the word freedom. It was as though Hasan had spoken the very desire that had lived in her heart for so long, the yearning for something beyond the gilded cage of her father's estate. "Freedom," she whispered, almost to herself. "Is that why you travel? To find freedom?" Hasan met her gaze then, and in that moment, Menka felt as though he could see straight into her soul. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "or perhaps it is to escape from the chains we place upon ourselves." His words hung in the air, and Menka felt a pang in her chest as she realized that, in many ways, they were both trapped, he by the burdens of his past, and she by the expectations of her future. For a long while, they stood in silence, the night enveloping them in its stillness. Menka's mind raced with thoughts of the world beyond her father's estate, the adventures that Hasan had described, and the freedom that she had always longed for. "I envy you," she said softly, breaking the silence. "You have seen so much, experienced so much. I have lived my whole life within these walls, never knowing what lies beyond." Hasan's expression softened. "Do not envy me, Lady Menka. The world is not as kind as it seems. It is filled with hardship, with loss. There are many nights when I long for the peace of a place like this, where the burdens of the outside world cannot reach me." Menka shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "I would trade it all to see what you have seen. I would rather face the hardships of the world than live my life in ignorance of it." Hasan smiled, a sad smile that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken truths. "You are brave, Lady Menka. Braver than you know." In that moment, Menka felt something shift between them, a silent understanding, a connection that went beyond words. Hasan, with his stories of adventure and loss, had stirred something deep within her, something that could not be undone. She knew then that her life would never be the same. The world outside her father's estate was no longer a distant dream. It was real, and it was calling to her. As the night deepened, Hasan turned to leave, but before he did, he paused and looked back at her. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, as though he, too, felt the bond that had formed between them. "Good night, Lady Menka," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Hasan," she replied, her heart pounding in her chest. As he disappeared into the shadows of the night, Menka stood in the garden, her thoughts swirling like the stars above. She knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. Her heart ached with a silent affection for the man who had shown her a glimpse of the world she so desperately longed for, and she knew that her life, and her destiny, would forever be intertwined with his. And yet, there was a darkness that lingered in the air, a sense of foreboding that Menka could not shake. Though she dreamed of a future filled with adventure and freedom, she could not know that the path ahead would be far more treacherous than she could have ever imagined. For in the shadows of the past, secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and the price of freedom, as Menka would soon learn, was far greater than she could ever have anticipated. Chapter 4: Forbidden Freedom. The early morning sky was tinged with the soft hues of dawn, pale pinks and golds stretching across the horizon. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of dew-soaked earth and the distant calls of awakening birds. Menka Bala, wrapped in a dark cloak, stood at the edge of the estate, her heart pounding with anticipation, fear, and excitement. For the first time in her life, she was about to step beyond the walls of her father's estate, unchaperoned, unbound by the rigid rules that had governed her existence. Hasan Walid, the Turkish merchant who had so mysteriously entered her world, stood beside her, his calm presence grounding her jittery nerves. "You're certain about this?" Hasan asked quietly, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. His voice, deep and steady, seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. Menka nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I've never been more certain of anything." Hasan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if weighing her resolve. There was a quiet respect in his eyes. He understood the gravity of what she was doing. To defy her father, to defy societal expectations, was no small thing. But Menka had tasted the sweet lure of freedom in her brief conversations with him, and now she longed to experience it fully. Without another word, Hasan turned and began to lead the way, his movements swift and purposeful. Menka followed closely behind, her pulse quickening with every step she took away from the life she had always known. They made their way through a narrow path, weaving between towering trees and thick underbrush. The farther they ventured from the estate, the lighter Menka's heart became. Each step seemed to unshackle her from the invisible chains that had bound her for so long. She had been a prisoner in her own home, her every action watched, her every decision made for her. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of those chains begin to lift. The journey was not without its dangers. The path was unfamiliar, and the forests surrounding them held a sense of foreboding. But with Hasan by her side, Menka felt an odd sense of safety. His presence was reassuring, his movements deliberate and confident. He had promised to show her the world beyond her sheltered existence, and she trusted him with a conviction that surprised even her. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change. The dense forest gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, Menka could see the faint outline of a river, its waters shimmering in the morning light. Hasan paused at the crest of a hill, turning to face Menka. "There it is," he said softly, gesturing toward the river. "The edge of your world." Menka's breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the scene before her. The river stretched out before her like a ribbon of silver, its gentle currents flowing steadily toward the horizon. Beyond it, the land seemed to stretch on endlessly, a vast, open expanse that beckoned to her with its promise of adventure and freedom. Her heart swelled with a mixture of awe and wonder. This was the world she had always dreamed of, the world she had longed to see, to experience. And now, here it was, laid out before her, tantalizingly close. "This is only the beginning," Hasan said, his voice low. "There's so much more to see, so much more to discover." Menka tore her gaze away from the river and looked at Hasan, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me this." Hasan's expression softened, but there was a shadow in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. "Freedom comes with a price, Lady Menka," he said quietly. "Do not forget that." Menka frowned, sensing a heaviness in his words. But before she could ask what he meant, Hasan turned and began walking again, leading her down the hill toward the river. As they reached the water's edge, Menka knelt down, her fingers skimming the cool surface. The sensation was electrifying, a reminder that she was no longer confined to the world she had once known. She could go anywhere, do anything. For the first time in her life, the world felt full of possibilities. Hasan stood beside her, his arms crossed as he gazed out at the river. He seemed lost in thought, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing something far beyond the landscape in front of them. "Where will we go next?" Menka asked, her voice filled with excitement. Hasan glanced down at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Wherever the road takes us," he replied. "There are villages to the north, markets to the south. The world is vast, Lady Menka. It is yours to explore." Menka's heart soared at the prospect of adventure, of discovering places and people she had only ever heard of in stories. But beneath her excitement, there was a nagging sense of unease. She had defied her father, left behind the safety of her home, and though the thrill of freedom was intoxicating, there was no denying the risk she had taken. Back at the estate, Menka knew her absence would not go unnoticed. Her father, immerse, was a man of strict principles, a scholar who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge and order. He had always been protective of Menka, seeing her as more than just his daughter, but as the living embodiment of his legacy. His expectations had been stifling, his love a gilded cage. Yet Menka had never doubted his affection for her. Even now, as she stood on the brink of a new life, a part of her couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her insides. She had left without a word, knowing full well that her father would be furious and perhaps even heartbroken. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its golden light across the landscape. Menka tried to push away thoughts of her father and the consequences of her actions. This was her moment, her chance to break free from the life that had been chosen for her. But even as she reveled in her newfound freedom, Menka couldn't ignore the sense that something was brewing back home. Something dark, something inevitable. Unbeknownst to Menka, Ammar Singh had already begun to suspect Hasan. The Turkish merchant, with his mysterious past and undeniable charm, had unsettled the old scholar from the moment he arrived. Ammar had spent years cultivating his reputation, guarding his family's honor, and he would not allow a foreigner, no matter how noble, to jeopardize that. Back at the estate, Ammar paced the halls, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal. He had always known Menka was different, more willful than the other women of her age. She was headstrong, curious, traits that both delighted and terrified him. He had tried to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, but now, as the hours passed and she remained absent, he realized he had failed. His thoughts turned to Hasan. The man had been nothing but polite, respectful even, but Ammar could see through the facade. There was something dangerous about him, something that made Ammar's instincts flare with suspicion. He would not let this man corrupt his daughter, not while he still had breath in his body. And so, as Menka and Hasan stood by the river, unaware of the storm brewing in the distance, Ammar Singh's mind was already working, formulating a plan to protect his daughter at any cost. Menka's freedom, it seemed, was not destined to last. The sound of the river's gentle flow filled the air, mingling with the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Menka closed her eyes, savoring the peace that surrounded her. For now, in this fleeting moment, she was free. Unaware of the shadows that crept ever closer, she allowed herself to dream of the adventures that awaited her, blissfully ignorant of the conflict stirring in the heart of her father. But fate, as ever, had other plans. And the price of Menka's forbidden freedom would soon become all too clear. Chapter 5. Ammar Singh's Fear. The sun had barely risen when Ammar Singh stood at the window of his study, gazing out at the vast expanse of his estate. The early morning fog clung to the trees, wrapping the world in a cold, eerie silence. But Ammar's mind was far from calm. It had been hours since Menka had disappeared, and his patience, already thin from days of uneasy observation, had worn out completely. There was something about Hasan Walid that had unsettled Ammar from the moment the man had arrived in Banga. The Turkish merchant had a quiet, measured demeanor, a politeness that, to many, might seem disarming. But Ammar saw through it. The way Hasan spoke with his eyes lowered, but his words calculated and precise, it all reeked of something hidden, something dangerous. Ammar had lived long enough to recognize the type of man who wore many faces. Hasan was such a man. And now, he was dangerously close to his daughter. The thought of Menka, his only child, slipping away from him into the arms of a foreigner filled Ammar with a dread he could not shake. She was young, impressionable, and though strong-willed, she could be easily led astray by someone as cunning as Hasan. The mere idea of Menka being influenced by the stranger gnawed at his core. Ammar Singh, a scholar of renowned intellect, had spent his life accumulating wisdom, teaching the young, and guiding his people with a steady hand. His name, and by extension his family, had become a symbol of knowledge and integrity. The arrival of Hasan had disrupted the calm, disciplined order of his life. And now, with Menka missing, Ammar knew his suspicions were justified. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. If there was one thing Ammar knew well, it was how to plan. His entire life had been structured around carefully laid strategies, both in his studies and in maintaining the delicate balance of power within his family. He would not allow that balance to be upset by some foreigner who had come to Banga with unknown intentions. A knock at the door drew him out of his dark thoughts. It was his loyal servant, Roghav, a man who had been by his side for years. "Master, the search party has returned," Raghav said, his voice low but steady. "There is no sign of Lady Menka." Ammar's jaw tightened, and his grip on the windowsill hardened until his knuckles turned white. He had sent men to search for her as soon as he realized she was missing, hoping she had simply gone for a walk in the nearby woods. But the news of her continued absence only solidified his worst fears. "She's with him," Ammar muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Raghav shifted uneasily, his eyes avoiding Ammar's piercing gaze. "With the merchant?" Ammar turned sharply, his eyes blazing with anger. "Yes, with that merchant. Hasan Walid. I should have known. He's bewitched her with his tales of foreign lands and riches. She is young, too eager to see the world beyond these walls." Raghav, ever the loyal servant, did not speak. He knew better than to question his master's judgments, especially when Ammar was in such a state of distress. Ammar's mind raced, trying to grasp at some solution. What could he do? Menka had always been independent, more curious and headstrong than other women her age. He had tried to protect her from the dangers of the world, to keep her close and shield her from those who would lead her astray. But it seemed that, despite all his efforts, she had slipped through his fingers. "She does not know what she is doing," Ammar said, more to himself than to Raghav. "She is young, and he is taking advantage of that. He must be stopped." Raghav nodded slightly, sensing his master's growing resolve. Ammar turned back to the window, his thoughts swirling. He could not let Menka fall into Hasan's hands, but brute force was not the answer. Menka's spirit was too fiery for that. If he were to take any action against Hasan directly, it might only drive her closer to him. No, he needed to be more careful, more calculated in his approach. An idea began to form in his mind. Ammar knew that people in Banga, especially those in his circle, trusted him implicitly. He had the respect and admiration of the scholars, the leaders, even the common folk. Perhaps it was time to use that influence to his advantage. If he could turn public opinion against Hasan, then Menka would have no choice but to see the truth for herself. But that wasn't enough. Hasan was a foreigner. He could easily leave Banga and take Menka with him if things became too difficult here. No, Ammar needed to ensure that Hasan never had the chance to escape with his daughter. He needed to remove Hasan from the equation entirely. A cold, calculated plan began to take shape in Ammar's mind. Poison. It was the cleanest, most efficient way to deal with the merchant. A well-timed cup of poisoned milk, presented as a gesture of hospitality, could eliminate Hasan without raising too many suspicions. Menka would be heartbroken, yes, but in time she would recover. And she would never know the truth. Ammar's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered the weight of his decision. He had never been a violent man, never resorted to such means in the past. But this was different. This was about protecting his daughter, his legacy, his family's honor. He could not allow a foreigner, a man whose motives were clouded by secrecy, to destroy everything he had worked for. His decision made, Ammar turned to Raghav. "Send word to the merchant. Invite him to the estate for dinner tonight." Raghav's eyes flickered with surprise, but he quickly masked it. "Yes, master. I will send the invitation at once." "And Raghav," Ammar added, his voice low and deadly serious, "prepare the special milk. You know the one." Raghav's eyes widened for a brief moment, but he bowed his head in understanding. "Of course, master." As Raghav left the room, Ammar turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could feel the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy cloak, but he did not waver. This was the only way to protect Menka, to save her from the dangerous path she was heading down. The fog outside had begun to lift, but Ammar's mind remained clouded with dark thoughts. He had always been a man of reason, of intellect, but love for his daughter, had driven him to a place he had never thought he would go. That night, when Hasan arrived, Ammar would greet him with a smile. They would talk, exchange pleasantries, and then, when the time was right, Hasan would drink from the poisoned cup. And by morning, Hasan Walid, the Turkish merchant who had threatened to steal Menka's heart, would be no more. As Ammar stood there, staring out into the distance, he felt a pang of regret deep within his chest. But it was quickly smothered by the cold, calculated part of his mind that reminded him of what was at stake. Menka would never know the truth. She would mourn, yes, but eventually, she would heal. And when she did, she would understand that her father had only ever wanted what was best for her. Ammar's heart ached as he thought of his daughter, but he steeled himself for what was to come. Love, after all, was sometimes the cruelest of all burdens. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Cup. The cool night air wrapped itself around the grand hall of Ammar Singh's estate, thick with the scent of freshly prepared dishes and incense. The soft glow of oil lamps flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the silence of the night. The room was lavishly prepared, a feast worthy of royalty laid out on the long, gleaming wooden table. Golden plates and goblets filled with exotic dishes and rich wines were neatly arranged, a picture of opulence that radiated warmth and hospitality. But beneath the surface, a much colder plan had been set in motion. Ammar Singh stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of calmness, though his heart pounded heavily within his chest. He had spent the day in careful preparation, ensuring that every detail of this evening went according to plan. Everything had to be perfect, down to the smallest element, for tonight, a man would die. He could not afford to show weakness, not now. His mind was set, and there was no turning back. For Menka's sake, for the honor of his family, Hasan Walid had to be removed from the equation, and this was the only way. Hasan entered the hall, his steps measured yet confident. His dark eyes scanned the room with the merchant's sharp observation, but nothing in the warm, inviting atmosphere suggested the truth of what awaited him. He greeted Ammar with a respectful nod, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips as they exchanged pleasantries. "Your hospitality is boundless, Ammar Singh," Hasan said, his deep voice filled with genuine appreciation. "It is an honor to dine with you tonight." Ammar smiled, a gesture that did not reach his eyes. "The honor is mine, Hasan Walid. It is not often that we are graced with the presence of such a skilled traveler. Your stories have brought much delight to my household." Hasan's face softened with a look of modesty, though a gleam of pride flickered in his eyes. He was a man of the world, a merchant who had traversed lands most only dreamt of, and the weight of his experience showed in his every movement. His tall, lean frame carried itself with an effortless strength, a man accustomed to navigating both the bustling markets and the treacherous paths of the wilderness. Yet here, in the comfort of this grand estate, he was but a guest, and Ammar Singh intended for him to remain so forever. As they sat at the table, the conversation began easily, both men discussing trade, the state of the kingdom, and their respective roles in society. Hasan spoke of the faraway lands he had visited, the customs of foreign peoples, and the riches that lay across distant seas. His words were captivating, his voice steady and sure. But behind the polite conversation, Ammar's mind whirled with dark thoughts. The meal was served. Plates piled high with aromatic rice, spiced meats, fresh vegetables, and sweet fruits were placed before them. Hasan dug in with enthusiasm, his appetite sharpened by the long day of work at the marketplace. Ammar ate as well, though his mind remained distant, focused on the singular act that would soon take place. As they neared the end of the meal, Ammar signaled to Raghav, his ever-faithful servant. Raghav approached with a silver tray, upon which sat 2 goblets of milk, their surfaces steaming slightly from the warmth of the drink within. This was no ordinary milk, but a rich, sweet concoction laced with a poison so subtle that it would take hours before its effects fully revealed themselves. Hasan would feel nothing at first, no pain, no warning. Only a slow, creeping darkness that would eventually take him away in his sleep. Ammar's heart beat faster as Raghav placed the goblets before them, one in front of Hasan, the other before himself. The servant's hands were steady, his face impassive, but there was no doubt that Raghav knew what was happening here tonight. "To health and prosperity," Ammar said, raising his goblet. Hasan smiled and lifted his own, not a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "To health and prosperity," he echoed, before tipping the cup to his lips and drinking deeply. Ammar watched, his breath held in anticipation as Hasan drank the poison milk. For a brief moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Was this the right course? Could there be another way to protect Menka? But no, this was the only way. His daughter's future was at stake, and no sacrifice was too great. Hasan set his goblet down with a satisfied sigh, his face relaxed, unaware of the death that had just entered his body. The two men continued to talk, the conversation flowing as naturally as it had before, but Ammar's mind was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of what he had done pressing down on him, a heavy, invisible hand that tightened around his chest. He smiled and nodded at Hasan's words, but his thoughts were consumed by the slow poison now coursing through the merchant's veins. Hasan, oblivious to the dark cloud hanging over him, spoke at length about his plans for the future. He intended to expand his trade routes, to visit lands even farther than those he had already seen. He spoke of new markets, new possibilities, and perhaps, one day, a life in Banga where he could settle and build something lasting. Ammar's stomach twisted as he listened. He could hear the sincerity in Hasan's voice, the quiet hope for a future that would never come to pass. The man sitting across from him, so full of life and ambition, had no idea that this would be his last night on earth. Hours passed, and the evening began to draw to a close. Hasan thanked Ammar once more for his hospitality, his gratitude genuine and heartfelt. As they rose from the table, Hasan smiled, a look of contentment on his face. "You have been most generous," Ammar sang. "I am in your debt for such a feast." "The pleasure was mine, Hasan," Ammar replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I hope we will meet again soon." Hasan nodded, but fate had already written a different ending for him. As Hasan left the hall, his steps as strong as they had been when he arrived, Ammar remained behind, watching the door close behind the merchant. A heavy silence fell over the room, and for the first time that evening, Ammar allowed himself to breathe. It was done. Hasan Walid was as good as dead. Raghav returned to the hall, his expression unreadable as he began clearing the table. Ammar stood in the center of the room, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He had done what he had to do. This was the only way to protect Menka from the foreigner's influence, from the unknown dangers that might have come with him. But the weight of his actions pressed down on him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Menka, too, would carry her own burden, though she would never know the truth. She would grieve for Hasan when the news of his passing reached her, but in time, she would heal. Ammar would make sure of it. As the night deepened and the hall emptied, Ammar was left alone with his thoughts. He stared at the empty chair where Hasan had sat, the goblet still half full with poisoned milk. The deed was done. The merchant would not see the dawn. And in the silence of that grand hall, Ammar Singh realized that the cost of protecting his daughter had been far greater than he had ever imagined. Tomorrow, the world would continue as it always had, but the shadow of tonight's act would remain, haunting him in ways that even he, in all his wisdom, had not foreseen. Chapter 7. The Empty Promises. The sky over Banga darkened into twilight, the sun retreating behind the distant hills, leaving a soft crimson hue in its wake. Menka stood on the balcony of her father's grand estate, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the last flickers of daylight slowly faded into night. Her heart was restless, but her mind was alive with hope, for she knew Hasan would return soon. They had spoken of it before he left. His promise still lingered in her memory like the sweet fragrance of the jasmine flowers that bloomed around her. He had gone to finish one last trade in the marketplace, to secure the final arrangements for their future. The thought of that future filled her with quiet excitement, a warmth that she had never felt before. It was a dream she had never dared to dream, a life far beyond the gilded cage her father had kept her in. Hasan had opened a window into a new world, one of adventure, freedom, and a love she could not yet fully comprehend. Menka believed in him, in his quiet strength, his unwavering spirit. He was different from the men she had grown up around, the noblemen and scholars who filled her father's court. Hasan's simplicity, his humble yet confident manner, drew her to him like nothing else. But tonight, as she stood alone on that balcony, something tugged at the edges of her thoughts, a faint whisper of unease that she could not quite understand. He should have returned by now. The day had stretched on longer than expected, and still, there had been no sign of him. Yet, she dismissed her doubts. He would come. He always did. The wind stirred, carrying with it the soft murmur of the city below. The streets bustled with the evening crowd, merchants packing away their wares, children laughing as they ran through the narrow lanes, and the distant hum of conversations filling the air. But even amid the noise, Menka felt a strange silence, a hollow stillness within her heart. She turned away from the balcony and wandered through the empty corridors of the estate, her steps echoing against the cold marble floors. The grand halls seemed more vacant than usual, and her father, Ammar Singh, had retired to his chambers early that evening. There was a weight in the atmosphere, a tension she couldn't quite place. Had her father not mentioned the feast he had shared with Hasan? He had spoken little of it, brushing aside her inquiries with vague replies. She had assumed it was nothing out of the ordinary, just another of her father's diplomatic gestures to show respect for Hasan, the foreign merchant who had, somehow, captured her heart. Menka drifted into the courtyard, where the moonlight bathed the garden in a soft glow. The gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets filled the night. She sat on a stone bench, her hands resting in her lap, her thoughts once again turning to Hasan. She smiled, imagining him walking through the gates any moment now, his eyes meeting hers with that familiar warmth. Their last conversation played over in her mind, his words like a gentle lullaby. "Once this is done, Menka, we will have all the time in the world," he had told her. "I will return to you, and then we can begin something new, something just for us." She had believed him with all her heart, and now she held on to that promise, clinging to it as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. The night wore on, and still, there was no sign of Hasan. Menka's heart began to stir with unease once more. She rose from the bench, pacing through the courtyard, her mind racing with thoughts of where he could be. Surely, something must have delayed him. Perhaps business had taken longer than expected, or maybe he had been held up by some unforeseen circumstance. But deep down, in a place she did not want to acknowledge, a seed of doubt began to sprout. It was a small, nagging feeling, a whisper that grew louder with each passing moment. "Where are you, Hasan?" The servants passed by her, offering soft greetings, but none of them seemed to know anything of his whereabouts. She stopped one of the guards, her voice trembling slightly as she asked if he had seen Hasan return. "No, my lady," the guard replied. "We have had no word of him since this morning." Menka thanked him and walked away, her heart now heavy with a sense of dread she could no longer ignore. She hurried back to the estate, her mind spinning with thoughts she had been trying to suppress. What if something had happened? What if he was hurt or lost? But no, she refused to believe it. Hasan was strong, capable. He had faced far worse dangers in his travels across foreign lands. He would return as he had promised. He would. By the time Menka reached her chambers, the night had deepened, and the estate was enveloped in an eerie quiet. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the gates below, her heart beating faster with every minute that passed. The hope that had once filled her began to falter, replaced by an ache she could not fully understand. And yet, she waited. The hours slipped by, and still, the gates remained closed, no sign of Hasan anywhere. Menka's mind began to spiral into dark places where she imagined all the terrible things that could have gone wrong. But she shook her head, forcing herself to hold on to the last thread of hope. Hasan would come back. He had to. The future they had envisioned was still within reach, wasn't it? But as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting its pale glow over the sleeping city, Menka felt the weight of an unspoken truth settle upon her. The night had come and gone, and with it, the promise of Hasan's return seemed to slip further from her grasp. Still, she did not give up. She would not allow herself to believe the worst. She would wait as long as it took. She would hold on to the future they had dreamed of, even if the rest of the world told her otherwise. The whispers of the city began to stir once more, the faint sounds of life returning to the streets. But for Menka, the morning brought no relief, only a deeper sense of loss she couldn't yet understand. And so, she waited, alone, with nothing but the empty promises of a future that had not yet come to pass. Chapter 8. Whispers of Betrayal. The days stretched long and empty. Hasan had not returned, and the void left by his absence gnawed at Menka's soul. At first, she held on to hope, clinging to his promise, to the belief that something had simply delayed him. But as the days became weeks, that hope began to fray at the edges, unraveling with every passing hour. The city of Banga, once a place of excitement and new possibilities, had transformed into a suffocating cage. Wherever Menka went, whispers followed her, small, hushed voices that slithered through the narrow streets, filling the air with poisonous rumors. "He's gone, hasn't he? The merchant from afar? Left without a trace. Perhaps he was never serious about her. A foreigner like him, who knows what his true intentions were. I heard he cheated her, used her for what he needed and disappeared. Poor Menka." At first, Menka tried to ignore the gossip. She told herself that people would always talk, always speculate. But as the rumors spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the city, it became impossible to escape their reach. No matter where she turned, the murmurs seemed to follow her, growing louder, more insistent. She could see it in their eyes, the servants, the traders, even her father's courtiers. The pity, the judgment, as if they all knew something she didn't. As if they had already decided that Hasan had abandoned her, that he had betrayed her trust. Menka would often overhear the conversations of the women in the marketplace, their voices low but dripping with disdain. "Poor girl," one would say, shaking her head. "She was so taken with that merchant. Now look at her, waiting for a man who will never return." "They say he was nothing more than a rogue," another would add. "Men like him, they come and go, leaving nothing but broken hearts behind." The words struck Menka like blows, each one sinking deeper into her chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. She wanted to scream, to shout that they were wrong. Hasan wasn't a traitor. He wouldn't have left her without a word. But the more she heard, the more those poisonous doubts began to seep into her own thoughts. Was it possible? Had Hasan really abandoned her? Had he made promises he never intended to keep? The thought was unbearable, but it lingered, festering in her heart like an open wound. She couldn't reconcile the Hasan she knew, the man who had shared his dreams with her, who had looked at her with such tenderness, with the figure the town was now painting him to be. One evening, Menka sat by her window, her gaze distant as she stared at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, twinkling faintly against the velvet night, but she felt no comfort in their light. All she could hear were the whispers, swirling around her like ghosts. Her father, Immerse, had been oddly silent on the matter. He had neither mentioned Hasan's absence nor the rumors that plagued Menka's every step. But his silence was even more damning. It was as if he already knew the truth and was merely waiting for her to accept it. Menka's heart ached with confusion and sorrow. Every fiber of her being wanted to believe in Hasan, in the future they had imagined together. But with each passing day, the weight of the rumors grew heavier, threatening to crush her spirit entirely. The worst part was that she had no one to turn to. She was alone in her grief, unable to share her fears with anyone. To admit her doubts would be to give them power, to acknowledge that the whispers might be right. And Menka couldn't bear the thought of that. Late into the night, Menka would find herself pacing her chambers, her mind racing with questions she could not answer. Where was Hasan? Why hadn't he returned? Had something terrible happened, or had he truly deceived her? The wall seemed to close in around her, and the once vibrant world outside her window now felt like a distant, unreachable dream. Menka's heart cracked under the weight of uncertainty, and the love she had once held so close now felt fragile, like it could shatter with a single breath. But still, Menka refused to let go completely. Deep inside, buried beneath the layers of doubt and pain, a small part of her still held on to the belief that Hasan would come back. That the rumors were nothing more than the idle talk of a bored town, and that he would return to her, just as he had promised. And yet, the whispers continued. Whispers of betrayal, of a love abandoned, of a heart left broken. And with each passing day, they chipped away at the last remnants of Menka's hope, leaving her standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering between belief and despair. The silence of Hasan's absence was deafening, but the whispers of betrayal were louder still, and Menka found herself caught in their merciless grip, unable to escape the pain that had begun to consume her. And so, she waited, heart-torn between the promise of a future that had not come to pass and the cruel whispers that threatened to tear her world apart. Chapter 9. A Lonely Vigil. The days dragged on, blurring into one another, as if time itself had conspired to test the limits of Menka's resolve. The sun rose and set, the seasons shifted, and yet Menka remained, waiting, ever waiting. Each morning she would rise with a singular thought: today will be the day Hasan returns. But as evening fell, and the night closed in with its cold, unrelenting silence, she was left to confront the same bitter reality: he was still not there. The rumors had not abated. If anything, they had grown louder, more vicious. It seemed that with each passing week, the town of Banga was more convinced of Hasan's betrayal. Everywhere Menka went, she felt the weight of their judgment, the way their eyes followed her, filled with either pity or scorn. Still waiting, is she? A woman had whispered just the other day at the market, loud enough for Menka to hear. The poor thing. Hasan is never coming back. How long will she fool herself? It stung. The words pricked at her heart, but Menka refused to let them break her. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Deep down, in the most sacred corner of her heart, she held on to the belief that Hasan had not abandoned her. He was out there, somewhere, and he would return. She had to believe that. It was the only thing keeping her from drowning in despair. The people around her couldn't understand. They saw her waiting as foolish, as the act of a lovesick girl who couldn't accept the truth. But they didn't know Hasan the way she did. They hadn't seen the fire in his eyes when he spoke of their future, hadn't felt the weight of his promises. Menka clung to those memories, to the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, to the strength of his hands when they had brushed hers. Those moments were real, and they meant something. They weren't just empty words, spoken to fill the silence. He will return. The thought was both her shield and her torment. It gave her strength in the face of relentless gossip, but it also fed the growing ache inside her, the gnawing sense of uncertainty. For no matter how much she tried to reassure herself, the doubt lingered in the quiet moments, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Immerse, her father, had been watching her closely in recent weeks. His suspicion had turned into something sharper, colder. Menka could feel it in his presence, the way he would look at her for just a beat too long, as if searching for signs of her unraveling. He had never spoken of Hasan again after the merchant's disappearance, but Menka could tell her father knew more than he let on. There was something in his silence, something heavy and unreadable. And yet, Menka said nothing to him. What could she say? She had no proof that Hasan would return, only faith. But she would not let her father or anyone else tear down the hope she held so tightly. Most days, Menka found herself at the edge of the city, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She would stand for hours, watching the road, waiting for the figure of Hasan to emerge from the dust. But the road remained empty. Still, she did not lose hope. She told herself that one day he would appear, riding towards her with a smile on his face, ready to fulfill the promises they had made. In her dreams, she saw him tall and proud, with the sun casting a halo around him as he approached. In these dreams, he would take her hand, and together they would leave Banga behind, embarking on the journey they had once imagined. But each time she awoke, reality came crashing back in, and the cold emptiness of her room greeted her instead. Her days were lonely, and her nights were worse. Sleep eluded her more often than not, and when it did come, it brought with it restless dreams and the echo of voices, whispers of betrayal, shadows of doubt. Yet through it all, Menka remained steadfast. She refused to let the darkness consume her. One evening, as Menka sat by her window, watching the dying light of the sun, her maid, Lada, entered the room. Lada had been with her since childhood, and though she rarely spoke of it, Menka knew she worried for her. "You're waiting again," Lada said softly, placing a tray of food on the table. "You shouldn't be out here so late. The nights are growing colder." "I'm fine, Lada," Menka replied, though her voice was quiet, far away. Lada hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice low and filled with concern. "People are talking, Menka. They think you should stop waiting. It's been too long. They're saying terrible things." "I know what they're saying." Menka's tone was sharp, but there was a tremble beneath the surface. She couldn't bear to hear the rumors repeated aloud. Lada's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort. "I'm only worried about you. You don't have to listen to them, but you can't keep torturing yourself like this. What if?" "He's coming back," Menka cut in, her voice firm despite the storm brewing in her chest. "He wouldn't leave me. He promised." Lada sighed but said no more. She knew better than to argue with Menka when her mind was set. But as she turned to leave, Menka could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air. "What if you're wrong?" The silence that followed was deafening. Alone once more, Menka stared out into the gathering darkness, her heart heavy with the weight of her vigil. She had chosen this path to wait, to believe, and she would see it through, no matter how long it took. The world around her might have lost faith, but Menka's hope was a stubborn flame, refusing to be extinguished by doubt or time. She would wait for Hasan, for as long as it took. Whether it was days, months, or even years, she would be there watching, waiting, believing. For Menka, love was not something that could be swayed by the cruel whispers of others. It was a promise she had made, not just to Hasan, but to herself. A promise to hold on to what was real, even when the rest of the world turned against her. And so, Menka remained in her lonely vigil, her heart still tied to the man who had vanished from her life, but never from her soul. Chapter 10. A Love Left Unanswered. The days had grown colder. A faint chill hung in the air, seeping into every corner of Menka's home, much like the deepening ache in her heart. She sat by the same window where she had waited for countless months, her eyes tracing the familiar road that stretched beyond the horizon, disappearing into the mist. The same road Hasan had promised to return on. But the road was always empty. Menka's vigil had not wavered. Every morning, she greeted the rising sun with hope, and every night, she whispered a silent prayer to the stars. But with each passing day, her hope, like the fading light of autumn, grew dimmer. The cold nights seeped into her bones, and her heart, once full of dreams and anticipation, felt like a hollow shell. The whispers in the town had become venomous. Menka could not escape the talk of Hasan's betrayal, no matter where she went. The town's gossip had turned from idle speculation to cruel certainty. They had branded him a deserter, a man who had lured her into his promises only to abandon her without a second thought. He left her, the women at the market would say, shaking their heads in false sympathy. He was never coming back. Poor girl, she's living in a dream. Even her father, Ammar Singh, seemed to grow more impatient with her vigil. His eyes were hard, his demeanor stern whenever she spoke of Hasan. "It is time to let this fantasy go, Menka," he said to her one evening. "Hasan is gone, and he will not return. You are bringing shame upon this family with your foolishness." But Menka refused to listen. Deep in her heart, she believed that something had happened, some unforeseen misfortune that had delayed Hasan. She could not, would not, believe the rumors. Hasan was not a traitor. He would never leave her. And yet, the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, and her hope was wearing thin. One evening, as she sat by the window, her breath fogging the cold glass, Lada entered the room quietly. Her maid, ever watchful, had grown increasingly concerned. "Menka," she whispered softly, kneeling beside her. "You've been waiting for so long. The townsfolk, they are cruel. You do not deserve the suffering. Please, let him go." Menka's hands tightened in her lap. She shook her head, her voice a faint tremor. "He will come back, Lada. I know he will." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of her heart. Her memories of Hasan, the way his eyes had burned with intensity when he spoke of their future, the warmth of his touch, felt like distant dreams now. She held on to them, but they were slipping from her grasp like sand through her fingers. Another month passed. The first snows began to fall, blanketing the town in a soft, cold hush. Menka wrapped herself in a heavy shawl, her fingers tracing the frost on the windowpane. She had begun to avoid the town entirely, no longer able to bear the stares and whispers. Inside the confines of her home, she could still cling to the illusion of hope. But that hope shattered on a cold winter's morning. It was Ammar Singh who broke the silence, his voice low and filled with a strange mixture of relief and guilt. He approached her cautiously, as though he feared his words might crack the fragile shell of her resolve. "Menka," he began, his voice strained. "You must stop this. Hasan will never return." Menka's heart froze. There was something in her father's tone, something final. She stared at him, her chest tightening. "What do you mean?" Ammar Singh exhaled deeply, as though the weight of the secret he had carried was finally too much to bear. "Hasan is dead, Menka," he said quietly, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "He has been dead for months." Her world tilted. The ground beneath her seemed to slip away, and Menka felt herself falling into a darkness she could not escape. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She could only stare at her father, disbelief flooding her senses. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, that's not true. He can't be." But Ammar Singh's eyes were filled with a grim certainty. He took a step closer, his face etched with the weight of his confession. "I invited him to our home, Menka. I offered him food and drink as a gesture of goodwill, but it was all a lie. I poisoned him." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Menka's heart stopped. The room spun around her, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. Her father's voice seemed distant, as though coming from another world. The walls closed in, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on her chest until she could hardly breathe. "I did it for you," Ammar Singh continued, his voice trembling. "He was filling your head with dangerous ideas, leading you away from your family, your duty. I couldn't let that happen." Tears filled Menka's eyes, blurring the image of her father as he spoke. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the horror unraveling before her. Hasan, dead? Poisoned? By her own father's hand? "No," she choked out, shaking her head violently. "You're lying. He promised me. He promised he would return. But her father's face was set in stone, his guilt masked by a cold, unyielding resolve. He is gone, Menka. You must accept that. Menka's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, her sobs racking her body. The pain was unbearable, a searing wound that cut deeper than any physical blow. She had waited for so long, believing in Hasan's return, holding onto the hope that their love would triumph over the darkness. And now, that hope was gone. Shattered. Hasan had been dead for months, his death hidden from her, his love stolen by the very man she had trusted most. Immerse knelt beside her, reaching out a trembling hand, but Menka recoiled, her heart filled with both anguish and rage. You took him from me, she cried, her voice breaking. You killed him. How could you do this? Her father's eyes were wet with unshed tears, but he remained silent. There was nothing he could say to ease the devastation he had caused. Menka felt her heart crumble. The dreams she had cherished, the future she had imagined with Hasan, all of it was gone, lost to the poison in her father's hands. She had been waiting for a man who would never return, her life suspended in a cruel limbo of false hope and unanswered love. In that moment, Menka realized the full depth of her tragedy. Hasan's death had been hidden from her, his love silenced forever. And she, blinded by faith and love, had waited in vain for a future that could never be. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, Menka wept for the love that was lost, for the man who would never come back to her, and for the shattered remains of her heart. Hasan's death would remain forever unknown to the world, his name tainted by rumors of betrayal, and Menka would be left to carry the weight of their unresolved love for the rest of her days. A love left unanswered,